Hello and welcome back to my RC channel. I'm AndyRC and today I'm going to be taking a look at the LDA 200 GT. Now, I've had a lot of requests for this one in the comments and I can see why. And I'll tell you now, it's a really decent package, but if you are fairly new to this, then there are some really important things that you need to know about this model in order to have a good and a safe experience. So, at the making of this video, this model costs just £114 or $152 thereabouts, and that is without a receiver, so I'm using an XM Plus here flashed with the RSSI on channel 8. And they give you these 1mm pitch 4-pin JST connectors to solder up your receiver, and they are labelled up really nicely actually, and they give you two as well, which I think is really nice. But it plugs into the back of the copter, so you have to undo the four 1.5mm hex screws in order to plug it in, which is not a big deal, I guess. The cable ties and heat shrink are all mine, although they do give you a few cable ties in the package. By the way, it does come in one of the LDA-RC tubs, but this is a 5-inch, so it won't fit in there with the props on. And there is one aspect of this model that I would say is pretty dangerous, and that is the foam battery mat that they have provided underneath. You can see that I've added some 3M silicone to mine, and that is because the stock foam doesn't work well at all, regardless of the battery strap you use, and every single flight that I had with it ended in a battery throw, even with just moderate flying. So, I know LDA-RC have used this system in the past on micros, but this isn't a micro and the system doesn't work. So if you're getting this model, I'll link to the Silicone Mat in the below because I can't stress this enough. It is a must. You'll also notice that this is a RunCam battery strap that I'm using. The stock one doesn't fit through the frame. The components on the ESC get in the way, so I wouldn't even try to push it through, so you'll have to get a different battery strap. And while I'm talking about its issues, these directional nuts that they give you for the motors are really tight. And LDA-RC, if you're listening, you need to provide some kind of tool to hold the motors in place so that we can tighten the nuts up. Because I absolutely destroyed the skin on my hands trying to do it. Even using a bit of cloth wasn't enough. These are ridiculously tight compared to any other motor that I've seen on the market before. But that's actually all of the bad stuff out of the way, and despite those initial flaws, this is a superb model and I really like what they have done. Now, I would class this as an ultralight. It comes in with its receiver, props and battery strap at 199 grams, and that's pretty impressive because the integrity of the frame hasn't been compromised. We have this thick and sturdy 4mm carbon True X frame, and at this weight it's never gonna break. And when you couple that with the fact that we have the aluminium egg dome from the Fly Egg, this is one tough model. And I really like how they've tidied up the wires as well with this tape. So they have got everything this light from their component choice. So let's start with the motors. They are an LDA-RC branded 1806 2500 kV motor. So some of you guys who have been in the hobby a while will know that 5-inch actually started on this size of motor, but back then Copters were really heavy, so they started putting bigger stator motors on there to cope with the load. Now the motors seem well protected with these bits of carbon that stick out. They do give you in the package these motor bumpers, but honestly I wouldn't use them. They add weight and in my experience they don't really do much at all. So the 18 size stator motor will be a lot lighter than a 22 or 23 size stator motor, but it is a compromise in terms of performance. So 199 grams sounds good, doesn't it? But from the testing that I've done with ultralights, there is a limit when it comes to motor choice. And when you go down in stator size, it becomes more difficult for the motor to turn a higher pitched prop. And back in the day, that wasn't a problem because we really only had one prop choice. But now they have gone crazy on pitch with props. And if you put one of those newer props on this setup, then you could end up burning up the electronics. So for an old school motor, they have provided an old school prop. This is the AndyRC 5040, and they have even put a warning in the manual not to use heavy pitch props, and I totally agree with them, and this is actually a pretty decent prop. So the ESC board is a 4-in-1. It's BL-Heli-S, and they are 20 amp with a 25 amp 5-second burst, and they are set up for DShot 600. The flight controller is the AndyRC FlyTower F4, which has Betaflight on-screen display. Yes, AndyRC has finally stepped into this century, so well done for that. It's come flash with Betaflight version 3.21, and I've left the setup as close to the original as I could for you guys because I know you like that. I have had to change the channel map to TAER to match my Tyrannus because it was set up as AETR out of the box. I've also added RSSI on the channel 8 as well. The digital idle I've changed to 6% to avoid death rolls, and I've put my rates in there as well at 0.8, but I've left their PIDs the same. I've also reduced the battery warning voltage to 3 volts so the beeper doesn't go off under throttle, and I've turned air mode permanently on, which wasn't selected for some reason, and I strongly recommend at this point to have it permanently on with this model. So at the back we have an LED board which is programmed to have indicators, and we also have a buzzer underneath, but it's not set up as a lost model alarm for some reason. Now the camera is the Runcam Micro Swift V1 with a 2.1mm lens, which is just an excellent choice. It's the NTSC version of the camera though, and it was set up in Betaflight as PAL, which meant that the on-screen display was sort of like semi-transparent through the goggles, so you're going to want to set that to NTSC and Betaflight. It's got this really nice camera angle system as well. We have 3 screws in total, and one of them is on a notch, so you can set your camera at exactly the right angle. Now, some people might not like this because you don't have a complete free movement of the camera, but I found it to be quite nice. And lastly, we have the classic 16-channel 100mW AndyRC VTX with a directly soldered 2 decibel linear antenna, which is cable tied nicely to the back. Now, this VTX can actually switch to 25mW, but they have made it really difficult because it's cable tied in, and to switch it to 25mW, it's actually a solder jumper, which is on the reverse. So, in short, it's stuck at 100mW. And when I test its output with my power meter, its decibel reading is consistent with a VTX that's running 100mW, where 0 dB has been calibrated as 25mW. So to change the channel on the VTX, we have the single button and then an LED sequence which you have to compare to a chart that you're given in the manual. The VTX is connected directly to the VBAT, and there are no capacitors fitted here, so I'm expecting some noise, but we'll have to see on the flight. The flight controller does have a 5-volt rail, but this VTX needs 7 volts to run, so that's why they have connected it to the VBAT. Something really important to note as well is that this is a linear antenna, and it's really the only thing that makes this model less beginner friendly, other than it throwing a battery, because that's no good for a beginner either. You should get really good results from this antenna, but you must use the right antenna combo on your goggles, which you'll only really get from using diversity. So I use the True D system with the Fat Shark HD3s. And that's in conjunction with the Menace Bandicoot patch antenna and the Onway cloverleaf antenna. And this combination gives me a reception that no other setup can. And if you were to use a single linear antenna, then you'd probably get terrible results from the video reception. So, as I say, this kind of antenna requires more of an advanced setup to get good results. Now, also in the box, you are given some spare props and some spare sticky tape. They've also given you some rubber bands, but those aren't going to be any use for your battery at all. I guess they've just given you the same package that they give for the micros. Speaking of the battery, it doesn't come with a battery, and they say to use a 1000 milliamp to a 1500 milliamp 4S. So what I'm going to actually do is go lower than that, because this flight controller doesn't have a current meter, but the ESCs are rated to 80 amps in total, so 4 times 20 is 80. And even though they've warned you about using a higher pitch prop, I know you guys are going to want to try it. So if I take a 850 milliamp 75C battery, 850 milliamp times by 75 is 63 amps. So if on full throttle I start to lose power with this battery, I can guesstimate the amps that this is drawing, and that will tell us if we can go up in prop size. And for the actual flight, I'll be using a 1300 milliamp Tattoo R-Line 4S. They say that a 1500 milliamp 4S will give you a 18-minute hover time, and I'm sure that is the case. And maybe if you're practicing line of sight hovering, then it's a good practice tool for that. But they are saying that an FPV flight will go for 10 minutes on a 1300 milliamp 4S. And I'll tell you now, the way I fly, that is not going to be happening either. Lastly, you are given this manual, which is actually pretty nice and worth a read. Okay, let's get in line of sight this thing. So I've got it out of the grass, nice and easy. Seems fairly quiet on idle, so this is just angle mode that I'm in here. Let's see what the punch is like. Yeah, it gets a little bit more noisy when you go up on the throttle. So perhaps this could have slightly more pitch on the props, but they are sort of advising not to do that. I tend to find when a model is fairly quiet on its props, then that's because it's not sort of over revving. You know, the performance seems alright with this, especially with the bigger battery. So, you know, we should get a good flight time, and I think that is going to be the key with this one, is the flight time, rather than it being good for like crazy power. But the power's not bad, not bad at all. I think if you tried to run an action camera, that might be different. I think it'd be a little bit sluggish with like a GoPro on the top. But again, I think this one is going to be good for, you know, someone who's fairly new that wants the longer flight time. You see those LEDs just about in the sun. The indicators are indicating the opposite way around. But I don't think anyone's going to be using those to know which way the model is going. Perhaps you can use it to confuse people which way you're going if you're flying with other people. Yeah, it's not overly loud though, moderate. I think you have to be careful choosing props with this. Because yeah, we did run 5-inch blades on 18 size stators. but they were low in pitch like this one. And I think the more you start to push it, the more you're going to heat up those motors. And I don't think there's much of a need for it. I think it's going to fly pretty nice on these props. And it is doing. Okay, I'm just going to do my usual flicker into angle mode to see if we've got any drift, because that's something that happens. I got asked that question the other day. Why do you always flick into angle mode at the end to check the drift? And that is because on a noisy system, you tend to find that the drift gets worse throughout the flight, regardless of the mode that you're in. So if you flick into angle mode at the end of the flight and you don't have any drift, then it's going to be alright, and this one's alright. You see, drift doesn't always show itself at first, at the beginning of a flight. It's something that gets worse throughout the flight, and this one is fine. So first of all, we have some full throttle runs with the 850 milliamp battery. So we have 73 mile per hour. Check out the voltage sag. So brand new battery sagging all the way down to 13 volts. So it's fair to say that this system is probably drawing around about 60 amps, something like that. There wasn't a tail off in RPM, so it was maintaining RPM. Interestingly, the 850 milliamp battery produced less video noise than the 1300, but the battery got really hot, so I don't think I'd recommend that battery for this system. So these are full throttle runs on the 1300 milliamp, and you can hear the RPM of the motor is higher, but we're not actually getting higher speeds. So I think it is fair to say that this model is slightly underpropped. There is a problem with going up in pitch though. First of all, when I landed on any flight, the motors weren't hot, but they were warm, and I kind of feel like if we pushed it any more, they would just get even warmer. And you see, this is a really lightweight prop as well. It weighs just 3.3 grams. So if you're thinking of going up to something like a GEM fan, the 5042, it's an entire gram heavier. And when you go up in pitch, it's harder for the motor to turn it, but if you go up in weight, it's also harder for the motor to turn it. So I actually think if you went up to something like a 5042, the extra weight of the prop and the tiny amount of pitch difference, I don't think you would see a benefit, and I think you would end up pushing this motor. So I think, in short, I don't think we really need to change the props, and if you do, you definitely risk overheating and over amping this system. So I would personally stay with this prop. Now, the stock tune actually worked for the 850 milliamp and the 1300. However, I did give it my own tune for the 1300, so I will just overlay that for you because I think I got a slightly better tune. Interesting that we're getting a little bit more video noise with the higher capacity battery, so you know, I guess you can run an 850 milliamp and get cleaner video, but if we stuck a capacitor on there, I also think that you will get cleaner video. And you can see the video reception, absolutely fantastic. This is without a doubt producing 100 milliwatt, I would say. So yeah, I think in general I like this setup. By the way, ignore the current meter that's just giving a random reading. You know, this is how the on-screen display came, and for some reason it had current meter selected. It doesn't have one, so you know, it's a small thing, but you know, I know you guys like me to run these as stock as possible, so I would remove that. But anyways, the flight time came to about a 6 to 7 minute flight time, not 10, but I think that's close enough, and I think that's what I can take away from this model, is that it's great for practicing. Just make sure that you've got a decent antenna setup, and this would be, you know, a fairly good beginner model. You've got lots of time to practice on it. Anyways, as it is such a long flight time, I will leave you with some flying, and I'll put a link in the description if you wish to get one. And if you found this information useful and can afford to do so, I'll link my Patreon in the below. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.